Good morning, episode 39, reading approximately 10 minutes a day from the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. And today is July 5th, episode 39, and we're reading in chapter 11 from Benjamin R. Tucker, State Socialism and Anarchism, How Far They Agree and Wherein They Differ, from the U.S. and A, 1888. So we're going to start about 2/3 of the way down on page 145, and here we go. Got a little piece of lint. Ugh. It was at this point, the necessity of striking down monopoly, that came the parting of their ways. Here the road forked. They found that they must turn either to the right or to the left, follow either the path of authority or the path of liberty. Marx went one way, Warren and Proudhon the other. Thus were born state socialism and anarchism. First, then, state socialism, and this is capitalized, state capitalized socialism, which may be described as the doctrine that all the affairs of men should be managed by the government regardless of individual choice. Marx, its founder, concluded that the only way to abolish the class monopolies was to centralize and consolidate all industrial and commercial interests, all productive and distributive agencies in one vast monopoly in the hands of the state. The government must become banker, manufacturer, farmer, carrier, and merchant, and in these capacities must suffer no competition. Land, tools, and all instruments of production must be wrested from individual hands and made the property of collectivity. To the individual can belong only the products to be consumed, not the means of producing them. A man may own his clothes and his food, but not the sewing machines which make his shirts or the spade which digs his potatoes. Product and capital are essentially different things. The former belongs to individuals, the latter to society. Society must seize the capital which belongs to it, by the ballot if it can, by revolution if it must. Once in possession of it, it must administer it on the majority principle through its organ, the state. Utilize it in production and distribution, fix all prices by the amount of labor involved, and employ the whole people in its workshops, farms, stores, etc. The nation must be transformed into a vast bureaucracy, and every individual into a state official. Everything must be done on the cost principle, the people having no motive to make a profit out of themselves. Individuals not being allowed to own capital, no one can employ another, or even himself. Every man will be a wage receiver, and the state the only wage payer. He who will not work for the state must starve, or more likely, go to prison. All freedom of trade must disappear. Competition must be utterly wiped out. All industrial and commercial activity must be centered in one vast, enormous, all-inclusive monopoly. The ready for monopolies is monopoly, plural to singular. Such is the economic program of state socialism as adopted from Karl Marx. The history of its growth and progress cannot be told here. In this country, the parties that uphold it are known as the Socialistic Labor Party, which pretends to follow Karl Marx. The nationalists who follow Karl Marx filtered through Edward Bellamy, and the Christian socialists who follow Karl Marx filtered through Jesus Christ. What other applications this principle of authority, once adopted in the economic sphere, will develop is very evident. It means the absolute control by the majority of all individual conduct. The right of such control is already admitted by the state socialists, though they maintain that, as a matter of fact, the individual would be allowed a much larger liberty than he now enjoys. But he would only be allowed it, he could not claim it as his own. There would be no foundation of society upon a guaranteed equality of the largest possible liberty. Such liberty as might exist would exist by sufferance and could be taken away at any moment. Constitutional guarantees would be of no avail. there would be but one article in the Constitution of a state socialistic country. The right of the majority is absolute. The claim of the state socialists, however, that this right would not be exercised in matters pertaining to the individual in the more intimate and private relations of his life, is not borne out by the history of governments. It has ever been the tendency of power to add to itself, to enlarge its sphere, to encroach beyond the limits set for it. And where the habit of resisting such encroachment is not fostered, and the individual is not taught to be jealous of his rights, individuality gradually disappears, and the government or state becomes the all in all. Control naturally accompanies responsibility. Under the system of state socialism, therefore, which holds the community responsible for the health, wealth, and wisdom of the individual, it is evident that the community, through its majority expression, will insist more and more in prescribing the conditions of health, wealth, and wisdom, thus impairing and finally destroying individual independence, and with it all sense of individual responsibility. Whatever, then, the state socialists may claim or disclaim, their system, if adopted, is doomed to end in a state religion, to the expense of which all must contribute, and at the altar of which all must kneel. A state school of medicine by whose practitioners the sick must invariably be treated. A state system of hygiene prescribing what all must and must not eat, drink, wear, and do. A state code of morals, which will not content itself with punishing crime, but will prohibit what the majority decide to be vice. A state system of instruction, which will do away with all private schools, academies, and colleges. A state nursery, in which all children must be brought up in common at the public expense. And finally, a state family, with an attempt at stirpiculture, or scientific breeding, in which no man and woman will be allowed to have children if the state prohibits them, and no man and woman can refuse to have children if the state orders them. Thus will authority achieve its acme and monopoly be carried to its highest power. Such is the ideal of the logical state socialist, such the goal which lies at the end of the road that Karl Marx took. Let us now follow the fortunes of Warren and Proudhon, who took the other road, the road of liberty. This brings us to anarchism, which may be described as the doctrine that all the affairs of men should be managed by individuals or voluntary associations, and that the state should be abolished. When Warren and Proudhon, in prosecuting their search for justice to labor, came face to face with the obstacle of class monopolies, they saw that these monopolies rested upon authority, and concluded that the thing to be done was not to strengthen this authority and thus make monopoly universal, but to utterly uproot authority and give full sway to the opposite principle, liberty, by making competition, the antithesis of monopoly, universal. They saw in competition the great levelers of prices to the labor cost of production. In this they agreed with the political economists. The query that naturally presented itself, why all prices do not fall to labor cost, where there is any room for incomes acquired otherwise than by labor, in a word, why the usurer, the receiver of interest, rent, and profit exists, the answer was found in the present one-sidedness of competition. It was discovered that capital had so manipulated legislation that unlimited competition is allowed in supplying productive labor, thus keeping wages down to the starvation point, or as near as practicable, that a great deal of competition is allowed in supplying distributive labor, or the labor of mercantile classes, thus keeping not the prices of goods, but the merchant's actual profits on them down to a point somewhat approximating equitable wages for the merchant's work, but that almost no competition at all is allowed in supplying capital. upon the aid of which both productive and distributive labor are dependent for their power of achievement, thus keeping the rate of interest on money and of house rent and ground rent at as high a point as the necessities of the people will bear. On discovering this, Warren and Proudhon charged the political economists with being afraid of their own doctrine. The Manchester men were accused of being inconsistent. They believed in liberty to compete with the laborer in order to reduce his wages, but not in liberty to compete with the capitalist in order to reduce his usury. Laissez-faire was very good sauce for the goose, labor, but was very poor sauce for the gander, capital. But how to correct this inconsistency? How to serve this gander with sauce? How to put capital at the service of businessmen and laborers at cost or free of usury? That was the problem. Marx, as we have seen, solved it by declaring capital to be a different thing from product, and maintaining that it belonged to society and should be seized by society and employed for the benefit of all alike. Proudhon scoffed at this distinction between capital and product. He maintained that capital and product are not different kinds of wealth, but simply alternate conditions or functions of the same wealth, that all wealth undergoes an incessant transformation from capital into product and from product back into capital, the process repeating itself interminably. That capital and product are purely social terms, that what is product to one man immediately becomes capital to another, and vice versa. That if there were but one person in the world, all wealth would be to him at once capital and product. That the fruit of A's toil is his product, which, when sold to B, becomes B's capital, unless B is an unproductive consumer, in which case it is merely wasted wealth, outside the view of social economy. That a steam engine is just as much product as a coat, and that a coat is just as much capital as a steam engine, and that the same laws of equity govern the possession of the one that govern the possession of the other. And we'll wrap for the day about halfway down page 149, again, reading from chapter 11, Benjamin Tucker, in the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. Bye-bye.